Zondervan is a huge Christian publishing house, one of the biggest in the world. They've published books by authors like Max Lucado, who for a while seemed to write a book every 3 months, by Rick Warren, who wrote The Purpose-Driven Everything, and by Lee Strobel, who published The Case for Everything. They've also published all sorts of those safe Amish-based novels that you may have seen. They're an evangelical publishing juggernaut. So, imagine that you write a story, and it's undeniably good. So you send the manuscript to Zondervan. But also imagine that this manuscript you're sending to the evangelical publishing juggernaut does not once mention God's goodness or God's faithfulness or God. Doesn't mention God at all, or praying, or worshiping, or any kind of religious faith. Also, while your story is riveting, there is a woman in it who's fired because she won't allow herself to be objectified by her boss, who wants her to stand and be leered at by a bunch of drunk men. Not exactly Zondervan material. But that woman is principled and heroic, and she stands up for what is right, so you could argue that your story is ultimately a good example for women. Except that what happens next in your story is that the search for that principled woman's replacement, that search is basically a year-long beauty pageant that has as part of the process a spend the night with the boss competition, and whoever pleases the boss most gets the job. And the woman who turns out to get the job is your main character, actually, in your story, who eventually gets the boss to do what she wants in order to protect her extended family, which sounds good, but her extended family then finishes your story by taking violent revenge on their oppressors, all with your main character's permission. The end. It's not exactly an Amish rom-com. How much chance do you think there is that your manuscript will be accepted by Zondervan? None at all, right? There's no way Zondervan would touch that. But the thing is that Zondervan has published that story because in addition to all its other books, Zondervan publishes the Bible. And as you may have noticed, I'm describing the story of Esther, which of course is found in the Bible. The New International Version of the Bible, known as the NIV, is the highest-selling modern English translation in the world, and it is Zondervan's best-selling book ever. And I just found out this week that the 15 scholars who started the project of writing the NIV, the 15 scholars include Heidi's grandfather. So basically, we wrote it. All of us here. We can all take credit. So this crazy story, with no mention of God or prayer or worship or faith, not only is it published by Zondervan, not only is it actually in the Bible, but it is one of the most amazing stories in all antiquity. It's filled with comedy and tragedy and with amazing plot twists where karma really hits its targets. And this summer, we're exploring the great storytelling that's found in the Bible, and so this morning our focus is the story of Esther. I wish I could just read the book to you in its raw text, because it reads so well, but I timed it, and it would take about an hour. And you know, this is church. We don't have that kind of time for the Bible. So instead, I'll tell you the story. It'll be paraphrased and slimmed down a bit, but there really won't be time for analysis or anything. We're just resting in the story. And actually, that's what God's people have done for millennia. Just hear the stories, rest in them, let them soak in. They don't always need to have some boring, profound person adding a layer of meaning on top. And so that's what we're doing this morning, except that this boring, profound person wants to give you 3 things to think about and listen for. First, as you listen, just notice how the power of women is an issue. At the beginning, women are just supposed to do what the men tell them to do. But by the end, Esther is telling all the men what to do, and she is praised for it. That's the first thing. Second thing, and here we go again, pay attention to the ambiguity in this story. While there are some pretty clear bad examples in this story, the question is, are there really any good ones? Esther and Mordecai are the heroes, but do the ends justify their means? And speaking of ends, the story's ending is problematic with all of its violence, and it might help to know that there's a long tradition of Jewish interpretation that thinks one of the points of the book of Esther is to warn against the kind of violent revenge that ends the story, that it was intended as a bad example, in other words. Something to keep in mind. And third, I just want to repeat, this is a secular Jewish story. No mention of God, no mention of praying or worshiping or faith. And there it is, this secular story, nestled very comfortably in the midst of our Bibles. I'll have a little more to say about that at the end. But here we go. This is mostly what we're doing. Let's go back to the time of the Persian Empire, a few centuries before Christ. Xerxes was king, emperor, really, ruler of the Persian Empire, and he ruled from the fortress city of Susa in the region we now call Iran. But his empire stretched from Upper Egypt to what we call India, so it was huge. In the 3rd year of his reign, King Xerxes gave a banquet for all the nobility and officials and military leaders throughout his empire. We're not told why. They all came to Susa, and for 6 months, Xerxes showed off all of his wealth, impressing them with his irresistible power. At the end of those 6 months, Xerxes held a banquet. It lasted 7 days and involved a lot of eating and a lot of drinking. Unlimited drinking. We are told specifically that the king's orders were to give the guests whatever wine they wanted, however they wanted it served, as often as they wanted it, for 7 days. At the same time, the queen, who was Queen Vashti, gave a parallel banquet for the women. At the end of those 7 days of feasting and drinking, when King Xerxes was, and I'm quoting the NIV here, in high spirits from wine, he wanted to show off one more thing: his queen. He sent a message to Queen Vashti to come before all these drunk men, wearing her royal crown, quote, in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. You hear that objectifying language? But Queen Vashti refused. We are not told why, but it's not too hard to think of some reasonable reasons, right? Well, if there's anything you don't do, it's refuse an emperor. Xerxes was furious, but also strangely at a loss. For all we know, this is the first and only time this kind of thing had happened to him. So he consulted a panel of legal and cultural experts and asked, what should be done here? And these experts had some pretty deep analysis for him. Here it is. King Xerxes, Queen Vashti has disobeyed you, which is bad. But also, what might be worse, when the women throughout your empire hear about what Vashti has done, they won't obey their husbands. They'll just say, Queen Vashti didn't obey King Xerxes, so why should I listen to you? And it'll be complete and utter chaos. Therefore, we recommend that you issue a 2-part edict throughout the entire empire in all its languages. First, announce that Queen Vashti is fired. Second, proclaim that every man is to be ruler in his own household. That advice sounded good to King Xerxes, so he did exactly that. Eventually, possibly years later, the anger of King Xerxes faded, but he found himself yet again at a loss, wondering, what now? There should be a queen. So yet again, he consulted his experts, and they recommended searching for the most beautiful young woman in the empire. Bring them in for months of beauty treatments, and then send them one by one to spend the night with King Xerxes. Then he can choose one of them to replace Queen Vashti as queen. And I'm quoting the NIV again. This advice appealed to the king, so he followed it. Meanwhile, there lived in the same city a Jewish man named Mordecai. He was a good man, with a cousin, a young woman named Esther, whose parents had died when she was young, so Mordecai had raised her as if she were his own daughter. She was undeniably beautiful, so she too was brought into the harem for the queen-replacing beauty pageant, and she quickly became the favorite of those who were in charge. Mordecai happened to work in the king's administration, so he was able to keep close track of how Esther was doing, and following his advice, Esther kept her Jewish heritage to herself. Now, before any of the potential beauty queens, literally, could move into the palace to spend the night with King Xerxes, they had to go through 12 months of beauty treatments. 12 months. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 more with perfumes and cosmetics. Then the candidate could take whatever she chose with her as she traveled to the king's palace for her one night. When it was Esther's turn, unlike the others, she did not go on any kind of power trip and make demands. She just took the advice of the person in charge of the beauty treatments, and that was what she went with. Well, Esther was the favorite of King Xerxes by far, so there was a great banquet held in her honor, and the entire empire took a holiday to celebrate the new Queen Esther. Sometime later, this is all set up, by the way, and the plot really gets going in just a moment here. Sometime later, unrelated, Mordecai discovered that 2 of the king's bodyguards were plotting to assassinate the king, which is kind of the opposite of being a bodyguard, if you think about it. Mordecai sent word to Queen Esther about this, who sent word to King Xerxes, and the plot was investigated and found to be true. So the 2 bodyguards were impaled on poles, which is funny to some people. Remember, tragedy plus time equals comedy. Anyway, impaled on poles, as an example. So, just so you know, there's a lot more talk about impalement coming up. So brace yourselves for some piercing narrative. Heidi's grandfather wrote that. Now, everything that happened to King Xerxes, everything he did, was written down in official historical records. The assassination plot obviously qualified and was put in there, and the historians did note that Mordecai was the source of the information. Okay, we've got background, we've got the characters, now the plot really gets moving. About 4 years after Esther became queen, King Xerxes decided to raise up and honor some total slimeball rich guy named Haman. The king even made a law that everyone had to bow down when slimeball Haman went by. But Mordecai would not. Esther's cousin wouldn't. Over and over again, he did not bow. His fellow workers got quite annoyed by it, and when they asked him why, he only said that he was a Jew. So they tattled. They told Haman, and when Slimeball Haman saw it was true, and when he heard the reason that Mordecai had given, Haman decided he would have not only Mordecai destroyed, but all the Jews living in the entire Persian Empire. There is a fragile ego. So he went to King Xerxes and invented a conspiracy about an unnamed people group, he didn't tell Xerxes who, scattered throughout the empire, who didn't obey the king's laws. And Slimeball Haman said to King Xerxes, "It's in your best interest to get rid of these people. Write an order that they all be destroyed. But it'll be expensive. So I'll contribute a lot of money to help cover the cost." Now, being an emperor is busy, overwhelming work. You've got like 6-month parties and stuff. So Xerxes just said, "Keep your money. Do what you think best. Here's my signet ring. I trust you. Write the law yourself and seal it with my ring." So Slimeball Haman wrote a law in the king's name, sealed it with the king's ring, and sent copies of it throughout the king's empire, saying that in about 10 months' time there would be one particular day, and it gave the date, when it would be legal to kill Jewish people. Throughout the empire, obviously, the Jews were shocked, and they grieved publicly, including Mordecai, tearing clothes and covering himself with ashes and things like that. Inside the palace, Queen Esther heard that her cousin, Mordecai, was grieving publicly, so she sent a messenger to find out why. This is the ancient equivalent of emails, back and forth, what we're about to get here. Now, she hadn't heard of this new law, and so far as anyone knew, it didn't apply to her anyway, since she had not told anyone she was Jewish. So she sent a messenger to ask why. And Mordecai told this messenger everything: the details of the law, the reason for the law, and the man who was truly behind the law, even though it was written in the king's name. And Mordecai added this to the message: "You, Esther, must go into the presence of King Xerxes and plead for the protection of the Jews." Esther sent a message back: "Mordecai, you know as well as I do that nobody can enter the king's presence unless they are summoned. All who try are killed, unless the king is particularly pleased to see them. But I haven't been summoned for a month. I could easily die." Mordecai sent a message back: "You're going to die anyway if this law goes unchallenged, because don't think that you'll always be able to hide your identity. No, I think it's your destiny to save your people. I think you're the queen at this time for a reason." Esther sent back this reply: "Okay, gather all the fellow Jews you can find and fast for me. Fast for 3 days. I and my attendants will do the same, and at the end of that time, I'll go see King Xerxes. And if I die, I die." And I want you to this is the only interruption, I promise. I want you to notice that Esther is giving the orders now. And that pretty much carries through the rest of the story. The story begins with men giving orders, and it ends with men receiving orders. After 3 days of fasting, the big moment arrived. Queen Esther was ready to break the law and go see King Xerxes unbidden. When he saw her, the law was, if he did nothing, she would be killed. But if he lifted up his golden scepter, then she would be spared and allowed to approach the throne. She put on her fancy royal robes, and she went, and she stood where King Xerxes could see her. And again, it had been over a month since they had spoken. King Xerxes looked at her. He saw her royal robes, and he was still so pleased she was his queen. So he raised the golden scepter, and she approached the throne. Now he knew there must be a big reason for her to put her life at risk like that. So he said, "What is it you want, my queen? Tell me, and I'll make it happen." Esther said, "If it would be at all possible, please come to a banquet I'm preparing just for you and Haman today." So the king immediately changed his schedule, gave orders for Slimeball Haman to join him, and they went to Esther's lavish feast. Now, King Xerxes knew that Queen Esther had not risked her life just to invite him to dinner. He knew she had not yet made her big request, and he waited until they were all drinking wine at the end of the banquet, and then he repeated himself. "What is it you want, my queen? Make a big, bold request, because I want to make it come true." "I'll tell you what I want, O king," said Esther. "Here it is. I want you and Haman to join me again for another banquet tomorrow. And tomorrow, I'll make my request." So another dinner date was set, and I can tell you that Slimeball Haman headed home from the palace after that first banquet on cloud 9, his feet barely touching the ground. He could not wait to brag to his wife and to his friends about being invited to a private banquet with only the king and the queen. Twice. But his buzz was killed by Mordecai, whom he saw on the way home, and once again Mordecai did not bow. This enraged Haman. He tried to hold himself together, and when he got home, he did spend a lot of time bragging to his wife and his friends, but it didn't work. He admitted that none of these honors gave him any pleasure anymore, so long as that non-bowing Mordecai was still alive. So his wife and his friends had very practical advice for him. It's nice to have helpful friends. "Look," they said, "all you need to do is have a pole built 20 meters high, and then after you impale Mordecai on it, you'll be able to relax and enjoy tomorrow's banquet. It's simple." So Slimeball Haman had the pole built quickly, and it was ready to go. But first, he did have to ask King Xerxes for permission to impale Mordecai, but it was late. So he thought, "I'll ask him first thing tomorrow morning," and lay down for the night with hope. Well, Haman may have slept well that night, but King Xerxes did not. You know these nights, wide awake, desperate for sleep. The king called for the sleepiest thing he could think of. He had someone read aloud the historical records of all the details of his reign. Who would have thought it? History as sleeping pill. And what do you know, the person reading aloud just happened to open the book at random to that moment in the past when Mordecai had interrupted the assassination attempt. "Who is this Mordecai?" asked the king. "And what's been done to reward him, to honor him? After all, this Mordecai saved my life." "Your Majesty," said one of the servants, "it would seem that nothing was ever done to honor him." "Who's there?" shouted the king right at that moment, because someone, just as dawn began to break, someone was standing ready to come into the king's presence. "It's Haman," the servant said. Yes, of course, it was Slimeball Haman coming first thing in the morning, as planned, to get permission to impale Mordecai. "Come in," called the king. "Haman, I know of a man I would like to honor greatly. What do you think should be done for this man?" Now Haman thought to himself, who else could he be talking about but me? So he answered the king, for the man you would like to honor, bring a royal robe you have worn and a horse you have ridden. Put the man on the horse and the robe on the man, and let someone who is highly respected lead this honored man on this horse through the city streets, shouting, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Yes, said the king. Perfect. Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do exactly what you describe for Mordecai the Jew, who works in my administration. Don't neglect anything you just said. If there's ever a time to feel sorry for Slimeball Haman, it's this time. He had no choice. He got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, and he himself had to lead Mordecai on horseback through the city streets, shouting, probably not very convincingly, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai, maybe a little puzzled, went back to his office. But Slimeball Haman ran home in a cloud of grief. He had barely had time to tell his wife and his friends all about this tragedy, and they had barely had time to say, oh, you can't possibly attack Mordecai now. You'd be ruined, when a servant arrived and rushed Slimeball Haman away to the second banquet that was hosted by Queen Esther. So he's had a bit of a dizzy day. The three of them had another private banquet, and afterward, when they were all enjoying their wine, once again, King Xerxes asked, what is it you want, my queen? Make a huge request, because I want to grant it. And this time, Esther finally answered. Here is my request, O king. I simply ask you for my life. Spare my life. For someone has plotted to kill me and all my people. Who? The king roared. Who would dare do such a thing? And Queen Esther answered, my adversary, my enemy, is this vile Haman. The king was so shocked and so enraged, he got up and left. And this vile Haman knew he was almost certainly doomed, but there was a little chance. So in desperation, he ran over to the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, and he begged for his life. But his begging was so intense and so desperate that he fell onto the couch just at the moment that King Xerxes came storming back into the room. Xerxes saw Haman on the couch with Esther and shouted, now he even molests the queen in my presence? And that was that. Just those spoken words from King Xerxes meant Haman was a dead man. And at that moment, one of the king's servants piped up, helpfully, hey, it just so happens that Haman had a 20-meter pole set up right near his house. He was going to use it to impale Mordecai, the man you just honored. Well, impale Haman on it, said King Xerxes. So they did. And after that, the tide turned. King Xerxes gave all of Slimeball Haman's wealth to Esther and the signet ring to Mordecai. But there was still the problem of that upcoming day of violence against the Jews, because laws in those days couldn't be repealed or vetoed. So Esther and Mordecai came up with a plan. Using the king's signet ring, they wrote and sealed a new law to be communicated throughout the empire. There was still time. On that very same particular day of violence, the Jews were now given permission to fight back, to attack and destroy their enemies and even plunder their wealth. Plus, now it was known that Queen Esther and Mordecai were themselves Jewish, so nobody really wanted to fight against their people. The official day of violence finally arrived, and the Jews did fight against their enemies and did destroy them. Those in the capital city were having such a good time, they even got an extension to keep fighting a second day. But they limited themselves to killing. They did not lay their hands on the plunder because, ethics. So the Jewish people were saved thanks to Esther and Mordecai. Not only that, Esther and Mordecai wrote down everything that had happened and used their authority to send decrees to all the Jews throughout the entire empire that they should from now on celebrate this day every year. And that is the story behind the Jewish festival of Purim. The end. As I have said, mostly our job this morning is just to sink into this amazing storytelling of the Bible, to savor it, to be kind of amazed and maybe even puzzled by it. But I will add one more thing. Again, this story is in the Bible, even though it does not have the word God in it, or doesn't have praying or worshiping or anything overtly religious. But it has been told and retold and written down because Jews and later Christians saw God in it, saw faithfulness in it somehow. Even if Zondervan would never publish it on its own, there it is in our Bibles. Does art have to be explicitly Christian to be Christian? Does it have to have the word Jesus in it to have Jesus in it? Is God only officially present when we say certain magic words? These are important questions, and I think the inclusion of Esther in the biblical library has something to say about those questions. We can find God in a story like this. We can find God in each star in the sky. We can find God in a lily-covered pond. The ambiguity and the secularity does not rule out the mystery of God. But that's a discussion for another time. For now, let's just enjoy the story of Esther and be amazed in general at all the different ways that God can be found by each and every one of us. Amen.